I'll be talking about the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was a guarded concrete campaign by an open area, later known as the Death Street, that contained anti-vehicle trenches and other defenses. The Eastern Bloc portrayed the wall as protecting its population from fascist elements conspiring to prevent the will of the people and building a socialist state in East Germany. In June 1989, the Hungarian government began dismantling the electrified fence along the border with Austria, and then in September, more than 13,000 East German tourists escaped from Hungary to Austria. And then from there, government officials decided to take down the wall. Demolition began in 1989 and finished in 1992. GDR authorities officially refer to the wall as an anti-fascist protection rampart, as others referred it to the Wall of Shame, a term coined by Mayor Willy Brandt due to restricted freedom of movement.
I'm Cindy, and today I'll be talking about the U-2 spy plane incident. An American spy pilot being caught on Soviet Union territory later became known as the U-2 spy plane incident. In 1960, the Soviet Union shot down an American U-2 spy plane in Soviet airspace. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, had been captured when the U-2 spy plane was shot down. This U-2 spy plane is used to take pictures without others noticing. President Dwight Eisenhower was forced to admit to the Soviets that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency had been flying spy missions over the USSR territories for many years. This incident had raised tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets during the Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to 1991. Gary Powers was later seen as a coward for carrying a needle full of poison to take his own life if he were ever to be captured. The Soviets were aware the U-2 spy planes flew over them because they would spot them on radar, but were powerless to stop them.
In today's news, we're going to be talking about the space race. Although the US and the USSR fought in World War II as allies, they never liked each other. One of their greatest conflicts was to get to space. After World War II drew to a close in the mid-20th century, a new conflict began, known as the Cold War. This battle pitted the world's two great powers, the democratic capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, against each other. Beginning in the late 1950s, space would become another dramatic arena for this competition, as each side fought to prove its better technology of the two, its military firepower, and by extensions, its political economic system.
Hi, I'm Samari McLeod, and I'm going to be reporting on the British invasion. The Beatles and many other bands had an amazing success in the US when they came down in 1964. Some might say it was the British invasion. It was a culture phenomenon, from rock to pop and fashion. British groups started to combine various British and American styles. Their fans reacted to this in a lovely way, causing them to become famous worldwide. This was leading to British stars to land songs on the top 100 in the US. Without this outbreak, some might say that music wouldn't have been the same to this day. That's it for today. On to the next person.
By the fall of 1963, President John F. Kennedy and his political adversaries were preparing for the next presidential campaign. Although he had not formally announced his candidacy, it was clear that President Kennedy was going to run, and he seemed confident about his chances for re-election. At the end of September, the president traveled west, speaking in 9 different states in less than a week. The trip was meant to put a spotlight on natural resources and conservation efforts, but JFK also used it to sound out themes such as education, national security, and world peace for his run in 1964. Crowds of excited people lined the streets and waved to the Kennedys. The car turned off the main street of Daley Plaza around 12:30 p.m. As it was passing the Texas School Book Depository, gunfire suddenly reverberated in the plaza. Bullets struck the president's neck and head, and he slumped over toward Mrs. Kennedy. The governor was also hit in the chest. The car sped off to Parkland Memorial Hospital, just a few minutes away. But little could be done for the president. A Catholic priest was summoned to administer the last rites, and at 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead.
Are you feeling depressed? If so, buy Fruit Loops at your local grocery store.
Oops, I gotta take this photo. Is it good? Why will go?
Hi, I'm Edgar, and I'll be talking about Cesar Estrada Chavez, born on March 31st, 1927, but died April 23rd, 1993. He was an American labor leader and a civil rights activist in 1962. Originally a farm worker, but also became the best-known Latino American civil rights activist. His public relations approach to unionism and aggressive but non-violent tactics that made the farm workers struggle with nationwide support. By the late 1970s, his tactics had forced workers to recognize UFW as the bargaining agent for over 50,000 field workers in California and Florida. During his lifetime, Colegio Cesar Chavez was one of the institutions named in his honor, and after his death, it became a major historical icon in the Latin community. Many schools, parks, and even streets were named after his honor. He is also famous for popularizing the slogan "Si se puede," Spanish for "Yes, it can be done," which was also adopted in the 2018 campaign slogan for Barack Obama. He has since become an iconic folk saint in the pantheon of Mexican Americans. He received many honors and accolades while still living and after his death, including the Presidential Award of Freedom in 1994.
Today we'll be talking about racial segregation. Racial segregation is a practice of restricting people from certain public areas based on their race. Places such as parks, schools, water fountains, restaurants, and even restrooms are segregated. Segregation in America separated whites from people of color, with whites seen as a superior race and the rest as inferior. Places that were segregated often had it to where the white area was much cleaner than the colored area. Segregated white schools only allowed white students to attend, but this all changed in 1954 when the Supreme Court passed a law to eliminate segregation from public schools. Although it wasn't until 1960 when Ruby Bridges was the first African-American child to attend an all-white school in the South. Bridges was escorted to class by her mother and U.S. Marshals due to violent mobs that were gathering outside and were unhappy with Ruby's presence. Bridges helped normalize the presence of colored students at all white schools. So thanks to her and activists from the civil rights movement, segregation finally became a thing of the past.
Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925. He then changed his name to Malcolm X. He was a minister and prominent black nationalist leader who served as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam during the 1950s and 1960s. Malcolm's father was a Baptist preacher named Marcus Garvey. His father was killed under mysterious circumstances. Malcolm dropped out of school at age 15 because of the discourage of white teachers. In 1946, at age 20, Malcolm X had been arrested for burglary. He had been sentenced for 8 through 10 years. While in prison, he became a member of the Nation of Islam. Due largely to his efforts, the Nation of Islam grew from 400 members to the time he was released from prison in 1952 to 40,000 members by 1960. While incarcerated, Malcolm developed a new worldview based in liberation and self-determination.
In today's news, we're going to be talking about Martin Luther King Jr., who was a social activist and Baptist minister who played a key role in the American civil rights movement from the mid-1950s until his assassination in 1968. King saw equality and human rights for African Americans, the economically disadvantaged, all victims of injustice through peaceful protest. He was a driving force behind watershed events such as the Montgomery bus boycott and this 1963 March on Washington, which helped bring about such landmark legislation as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and is reminded each year on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a U.S. federal holiday since 1986.
Hi, it's Samara McLeod again, and I'm going to be talking about the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a huge movement for African Americans' equal rights of being a U.S. citizen. This movement peaked in the 1950s and the 1960s when African American men and women organized and led this movement to not only to be a local problem, but national. They wanted to get their word across. They kept this fight going with petitions and protests. This movement became one of the biggest movements of the 20th century in the U.S. Although slavery was abolished, discrimination was very strong. They did not want to seem weak. They wanted to be strong for their people. This movement wasn't a one-man job. Some might say it took an army. They formed boycotts and marches, such as the bus boycott. This was not only a political, but a social protest against the policy of discrimination on public transportation. Martin Luther King was also one of the biggest person to form this movement. They had other marches. They created different marches to get their point across. They wanted the whole world to know they weren't violent. They simply just wanted their equal rights like everyone else. Eventually, in 1964, they were granted that.
I'm Brenda, and today I will be talking about the life and death of Joseph Stalin. For those of you who don't know, Joseph Stalin was the second leader of the Soviet Union, lasting from 1929 up until his death in 1953. Born December 18, 1878, Stalin was born in a small town called Gory, Russia. He was an only child and grew up very poor. But as a teenager, he earned a scholarship to a nearby seminary where he secretly began reading the work of German philosopher Karl Marx. This made Stalin interested in politics and the revolutionary movement against the Russian monarchy. Later, Stalin was expelled from the seminary and became an underground politician. He was arrested multiple times, but was eventually appointed to serve for a central committee of the Bolshevik Party. 3 years later, the Bolshevik Party seized power in Russia. 5 years later, the Soviet Union was born, with Vladimir Lenin as its first leader and Joseph Stalin as its second. Stalin ruled with terror and eliminated anyone who opposed him. Most citizens of the Soviet Union hated him, but there was nothing they could do about it. It is reported that Stalin is responsible for the death of 20 million people. In his later years, Stalin became very paranoid and at the age of 74, suffered a stroke on March 5, 1953.
I mean, heck, I can't just... This isn't funny. Hi, Miss Stewart. Good.
Yeah.
We're filming a commercial on eating cereal.
Too many. Then after the exile of then leader Vladimir Lenin,
I'll be talking about the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was I can't.